Good morning. I'm happy to welcome Professor Channell-Justice from Harvard University. Thank you for being here today with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. ICEUR is continuing its series of interviews with international experts on Ukraine and Russia. You are the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. As an anthropologist, you have had the opportunity to do plenty of field research in Ukraine, and you have specialized on political activism and social movements. So Russia is invading Ukraine, intense fighting is continuing as well in large cities, and it has proven to be difficult to get reliable information on what is happening on the ground. So what is your general assessment of the current situation in Ukraine?
Yeah, it is getting difficult to get good information coming out of Ukraine. There's some major humanitarian crises developing, in particular in the cities that are under siege by the Russian military forces. At this point, most Ukrainians that I have been in touch with recently still have access to the internet. So they're still posting on social networks as much as they can, just to sort of show, what the situation is. And they're doing a lot of work to, help evacuate people, family, friends, exchange information online. And they're the people that I work with are mostly in Kyiv at this point. But outside of Kyiv, in cities like Kharkiv, Mariupol, Sumy, we know that the situation has become extremely dire. We also know that some of the humanitarian agreements that have been made have been violated by the Russian Federation. So, civilians who have been trying to evacuate have been attacked. So I think, it's a very fluid situation. What's really important is that we make sure we are listening to the Ukrainian voices that can get to us in English-speaking countries and otherwise other European countries, because it's really important that we listen to what people are asking for in Ukraine.
Thank you. So many Western governments have condemned the Russian actions, and have they taken many sanctions? And well, the last thing I read is that even oil imports to the US and UK will be stopped, and the EU has promised to curb gas imports. So how do you evaluate what has been done so far?
I think it's a really dramatic Western response, not just the oil and gas imports that you mentioned, which is a huge step, but all the previous sanctions, the attacks on different banks, on different people within Putin's inner circle, major corporations like Coca-Cola and McDonald's pulling out. I think Coke, sorry, it might have been Pepsi. I can't keep them straight. But the point is that major corporations are pulling out of sales in Russia. These steps, I think, are really unprecedented. They are damaging the Russian economy. The challenge here, I think, is damaging the Russian economy in such a way that turns enough people against Vladimir Putin without him being able to spin the narrative that these sanctions are just trying to attack the Russian way of life. They're trying to attack what we're building. They don't want us to be a great power. Because we know in the past, Putin has been able to spin the narrative around sanctions to work in his favor. So these dramatic sanctions are, potentially shoring up support. But at the same time, we've seen massive numbers of people leave Russia. That's never happened before in previous cases of sanctions. This is, not only because of economic downturn, but also because of the aggressive crackdown on independent media, on protests within Russia. It's forcing oppositional voices to leave. So things, like I said before, are very fluid, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia, and how these sanctions and how the Western response ultimately affects Russia in the long term, I think we really can't say yet. But it is an aggressive and it's a united response, and I think ultimately that's a good thing.
Thank you. So many Western analysts are already highlighting severe flaws in the Russian military operation. So would Russia even have the resources to maintain control of a country with such a large territory as Ukraine?
It's interesting because I saw military experts, in January, before this invasion actually happened, saying exactly this, that the Russian military could not occupy Ukraine. It doesn't have the capacity to do so. The only way that they could actually win this special military operation, so-called their words, would be a swift victory. And of course, that's not what happened. So no, they really don't have the capacity not only to occupy the country and its large territory, but also they don't have the capacity to withstand a long-term Ukrainian resistance, which, as we have seen, that's what's going to happen. That could lead to a very prolonged conflict with lots of insurgents and guerrilla warfare. Obviously, that's not really a good thing. However, it's certainly not what was in the Russian military plan. So they're having to pivot now as well, and it's certainly not going well. And what we've seen also from any reports from Russian soldiers is that they don't have enough rations. Morale is very low. Most of them thought they were doing exercises. They didn't know they were going to Ukraine. So all of these things do not bode well for a longer military, I don't know, incursion or any kind of operation. But there's also that also means that there is a great risk that Putin will have to respond with greater, more aggressive force if his military on the ground can't get the job done. So it's not necessarily a good thing that the Russian military at this point has less capacity than we anticipated.
Since you mentioned the Ukrainian resistance, so far it seems to be much more successful than many observers initially expected at the beginning of this invasion. How does the organization and mobilization on the ground work, and what makes it so effective?
Well, there's a number of reasons. First of all, the Ukrainian military is doing a better job than a lot of people thought it would be able to, because it isn't as well equipped as the Russian military. But the Ukrainian military has been pursuing reforms for the past few years, and with the ultimate goal of potentially trying to join NATO. So the Ukrainian military is actually in a better position than it could have been. Obviously, what we're seeing is also a lot of people on the ground organizing territorial defense groups. So these are, unofficial, and by unofficial I mean, not affiliated with the police or the Ukrainian military in general. So a lot of these people are volunteers. A lot of these people are veterans. They fought in the Donbass in the past 8 years and are now remobilizing to serve to defend their cities and towns. So those networks are pretty well organized. They are undersupplied. They are some of the groups that are asking for people to donate money for them to get better supplies. So, how long they can resist with what they have is a big question. But what's also happening, these are the people who are helping the humanitarian evacuations from cities on the ground, right? These are the people who are making sure that civilians are protected as they get to safety. So these territorial defense units, I think, are a very important part of the response on the ground in Ukraine. Again, very fluid situation. We don't know how long they're going to be able to sustain it, but what they're doing is very important.
Thank you very much. So yeah, it didn't start 2 weeks ago. Actually, Ukraine has suffered from military conflict since 2014. How did Ukrainian civil society develop since the Euromaidan mobilizations?
Well, we know that civil society was a key aspect of the Euromaidan protests. We saw that those protests were self-organized. So they were organized by ordinary people who had skills that they were using to, advance the protest cause. And that continued when Russia occupied and illegally annexed Crimea, and that continued when Russia invaded eastern Ukraine the first time in 2014. So we saw similar civilian networks of people helping on the front lines. We saw those people helping displace people when people were forced to leave Donetsk and Luhansk region in 2014 and beyond. A lot of the response within Ukraine was also from civil society. It was also self-organized. So these networks have existed for a long time. And then now we're seeing those networks come to life again. And I should add, that's not just within Ukraine, that's happening, but these are global networks. So people outside of Ukraine who were also organizing to support Ukrainians over the past 8 years, they're organizing again. So one advantage that Ukraine has right now is that many effective civil networks were already in place. So that is helping people, find safety if they're forced to flee. That's helping people cross the border once they're in Poland. That's helping people find a place to stay in Poland. The US Ukrainian diaspora, so Ukrainian Americans, they have been helping Ukraine build its capacity for the past 8 years. And now they're collecting donations, which is really effective because they've been doing it for 8 years already. So I think that's one, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to glorify this. This is terrible, and I wish those networks didn't need to be used, but they are being used and they do exist. And it's good for Ukraine that they kind of already have this experience and they know how to organize themselves, because their response can be a lot quicker than the government response. And plus, this allows government to really focus on negotiating with the Western powers to ask for more military aid and the support of humanitarian aid. If civilians on the ground are able to do a lot of this work safely and well, then it allows the government to fight on this other front. And that's, I think, good for Ukraine right now in terms of people's immediate needs.
Let's continue talking about civil society. You've published extensively on feminism in the Eastern European context. Which implications does the present conflict have from a feminist point of view?
Well, this is a really important question. And obviously, the effect of war on women and children, we know, is different than the effect of war on men. That's in part because men are typically asked to mobilize to fight, and women are part of the civilian group that's allowed to, in the current context, they're allowed to leave the country, whereas men are not. One thing we see a lot of in Ukraine is women volunteers. Yesterday, of course, was International Women's Day, and a lot of the rhetoric was about supporting women in the military and who have volunteered to serve in Ukraine, which is, part of that right now, I think, is happening because the situation is so dire. Anybody who has the capacity to fight is fighting. Feminists that I've worked with in the past, they're taking a very interesting position. A lot of feminist rhetoric is very critical of war and takes a kind of pacifist angle. And a lot of the feminists that I've worked with in Ukraine are rejecting that angle for the only reason that they have no other way to fight back than with arms. Armed resistance is the only option that they see right now. And I think, in a kind of long-term academic sense, what feminists are asking for in Ukraine right now is very different and could make us kind of rethink feminist stance on the military. That's a very speculative kind of academic way of looking at it. But it's very striking to me the way that Ukrainian feminists are adapting to this context because they have to, right? They don't have any other choice. But again, going back to the civil question, a lot of these feminists have also kind of created networks to serve other functions not in active wartime, and a lot of them are going back to those. They're trying to preserve feminist libraries. They're trying to preserve the initiatives that they already started a few years ago, and that is something that's motivating a lot of people. So I think what this certainly has a lot of implication for women in Ukraine in general, but I think also for the question of feminism itself.
Thank you. So despite the war, there are still talks between Ukrainians and Russians on different levels. They have been talking about safe corridors to evacuate civilians. So what could be realistically done to improve the humanitarian situation of Ukrainian civilians right now?
I think the first priority is to get supplies to the cities that are under siege. Mariupol in particular is one we're hearing a lot of stories about. A young girl died from dehydration a few days ago. There simply isn't food and water, let alone medical supplies. So the most essential thing is to get people supplies, and then from there, establish humanitarian corridors that civilians can leave and get to safety. This is something that is on the table. This is part of the negotiations with Russia, and Russia is not doing these negotiations in good faith. So they are saying, sure, we'll give you a humanitarian corridor. And then we've seen examples of them attacking those humanitarian corridors of people who are trying to escape. So it's a very difficult situation because certainly we're seeing two sides that have a different level of acceptance of the importance of human life. And it's very difficult to understand how to find a solution to this problem when people are already living in a risky situation. Evacuating them is also going to be risky. How do you ensure and protect people's lives in these cases? It's a terrible place to be in. and it's a very difficult thing to negotiate for. But this is one place where I do hope that Western countries will consider getting involved. At least international organizations could theoretically help protect some of these civilian corridors. But because, like I said, the situation is extremely dire, people are under siege and they are unable to get food, they're unable to get water. There will be mass casualties because of this, and that's simply unacceptable.
Is there any additional point you would like to make in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I think, you know, I think it's just important to reiterate, there's so much we don't know. You know, in the Western press, we're seeing these pictures, you know, in images, lots of people moving out of the country, going to Poland. So far, the number is around 2 million people who are now refugees in Europe. Ukraine has 44 billion people. So that's really only a fraction of the people of the country who have actually left. We know much less about how many people have moved within Ukraine, where they've gone, how many people plan to stay. So I think in that sense, we are facing, I hope this isn't what happens, but I'm really concerned that we're facing a moment where we simply won't have good information about what's going on within the borders of Ukraine. Everything we're going to learn about Ukraine is coming from outside. And it's just really important to keep in mind, you know, people on the ground are risking their lives to get us good information so that we know what's happening. And so, you know, we just have to make sure that we're doing everything we can from our academic positions outside of Ukraine to help people based on what they're asking for, because they're the ones who are, you know, risking their lives to tell us what they need.
Thank you very much, Professor Channell-Justice, for being here today and for giving us insights and showing your point of view with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the questions.